What would you do if a $50 joke completely rewrote your life? An orphaned woman bought a condemned, boarded-up psychiatric hospital at a rural tax auction for the price of a cheap dinner. But what she found, hidden behind the crumbling plaster of the head doctor's office, shook the nation. Harper Quinn had spent her entire 24 years feeling like a ghost in her own life. After aging out of the Binghamton foster care system, she had learned to survive on the absolute margins of society. She worked 2 jobs pouring coffee at a dismal diner before dawn and stocking shelves at a regional grocery chain until midnight. She possessed no family heirlooms, no safety net, and certainly no generational wealth. All she had was a fierce, desperate drive to claw her way out of poverty. That desperation is what led her to the Monroe County Municipal Tax Auction on a blistering Tuesday in July. Harper had saved exactly $4,200. It was her entire life's work kept in a rusted metal tin under her mattress. Her plan was a modest bid on a tiny, dilapidated, tax-defaulted residential lot, maybe a foreclosure that she could slowly repair and flip. The local VFW hall where the auction was held smelled of stale beer and floor wax. Sweaty contractors and real estate investors crowded the folding chairs, murmuring over thickly printed catalogues of miserable properties. For hours, Harper watched as modest homes were snatched up by cash-rich investors for $50,000, $60,000, $80,000. Her meager savings were completely useless here. Defeated, she was preparing to leave when the auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Thomas Dempsey, stepped up to the podium and announced Lot 412. All right, folks, moving on to a special commercial property. Lot 412, the former Oak Haven Psychiatric Institute. 42 acres, approximately 40,000 square feet of main structure. Starting bid, let's say $50. Do I have $50? The room went dead silent. Several of the veteran contractors actually laughed. Harper looked at the grainy black and white photo in the catalogue. It was a massive Gothic brick-and-stone compound that looked like a fortress. Built in 1912, Oak Haven had been a state-run mental health facility until it was unceremoniously shuttered in 1978 amid budget cuts and whispers of gross malpractice. Since then, it had sat rotting behind chained iron gates. $50, Dempsey asked again, wiping sweat from his forehead. Come on, somebody give me $50. The copper pipes alone are worth that. What the auctioneer glossed over, and what every seasoned investor in that room knew, was the catch. In a municipal tax deed sale, the buyer assumes all attached municipal and environmental liens. Oak Haven wasn't just an abandoned hospital, it was an EPA nightmare. It was riddled with friable asbestos lead paint and collapsed roofing. The estimated environmental cleanup liability tied to the deed was roughly $1.8 million. Buying it wasn't an investment. It was financial suicide. But Harper didn't know that. She just heard the words, 42 acres and $50. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable impulse, the desire to actually own something, anything in this world, she tentatively raised her numbered paddle. $50 to bidder 82, Dempsey shouted, slamming his gavel down so fast it echoed like a gunshot. Sold. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The man sitting next to Harper looked at her with an expression caught between deep pity and absolute horror. Kid, he whispered, you have no idea what you just did. 2 hours later, Harper was sitting in the stuffy office of the county clerk, Margaret Higgins. Margaret, a stern woman with a sympathetic sigh, pushed a stack of terrifying legal documents across the desk. It was then that Harper learned about the $1.8 million environmental lien. If the property wasn't brought up to code or demolished within 3 years, the county could seize her personal assets and garnish her wages for the rest of her life. "I can't pay this," Harper stammered, her hands shaking as she held the heavy brass key ring. "I only have $4,000. It was a mistake." "The auction is legally binding, Miss Quinn," Margaret said softly. "The county has been trying to unload Oakhaven for 15 years. You own it now. May God have mercy on your bank account." The drive out to Oakhaven felt like a funeral march. The property sat at the end of a deeply rutted, overgrown dirt road, miles from the nearest town. When Harper finally pulled her beat-up sedan up to the rusted iron gates, her breath hitched. The asylum was terrifyingly immense. 4 stories of dark, weeping brick, towering archways and shattered windows that stared out like hollow eyes. Nature was reclaiming it. Thick veins of ivy choked the stone gargoyles, and the main oak doors were heavily chained and boarded up. Using a pair of bolt cutters she had purchased at a hardware store, Harper snapped the rusted chains and pushed her way into the main lobby. The smell of decades of decay, damp plaster and animal droppings immediately assaulted her. Her flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a massive foyer with a sweeping, rot-eaten staircase. Overturned wheelchairs scattered medical charts from the 1970s, and peeling seafoam green paint lined the long, dark corridors. She walked through the echoing halls, the weight of her catastrophic mistake pressing down on her chest. She had literally bought her own financial ruin. But as she stood in the center of what used to be the main patient ward, staring at the sheer volume of steel radiators, cast-iron bathtubs, and thick oak trim, a desperate idea began to form. She couldn't fix the hospital, but she could gut it. If she could strip the building of its valuable architectural salvage and raw scrap metal, she might be able to raise enough money to hire an excavation company to bulldoze the site and satisfy the county's demolition mandate. It was a monumental task, but it was her only way out. She had no idea that her desperate salvage operation was about to awaken a dangerous ghost from the past. The next morning, Harper invested a significant chunk of her remaining savings to hire David Miller, a grizzled, no-nonsense local contractor who ran a small salvage and scrapping yard. David took one look at Oakhaven and whistled through his teeth, but agreed to help her strip the place for a 30% cut of whatever they pulled out. "We start in the administrative wing," David advised, tossing a heavy crowbar into the back of his truck. The patient wards were stripped of anything valuable by vandals years ago, but the heavy oak doors, the brass fixtures, and the copper wiring in the executive offices on the east wing, that stuff is gold. The administrative wing had once been the domain of the hospital's elite staff. Specifically, the corner suite had belonged to Dr. Archibald Hess, Oakhaven's enigmatic head director from 1952 until his abrupt disappearance in 1975. Rumors had always swirled around Hess tales of extreme embezzlement from state funds, illegal private funding from wealthy pharmaceutical companies, and an obsession with security. It took Harper and David 3 days just to clear the debris out of the hallway leading to Hess's old office. When they finally pried open the heavy mahogany door, they found a room that had been surprisingly untouched by time or looters. The windows here had been bricked up from the inside long before the hospital closed, plunging the massive office into perpetual darkness. Harper aimed her high-powered work light around the room. There was a massive rotting desk, water-damaged bookshelves, and peeling wallpaper. But something about the space immediately felt wrong to her. "David, look at the blueprints," Harper said, wiping dust from her face as she unrolled a set of faded yellowing architectural plans they had found in the basement archives. She pointed a dirty finger at the schematic of the East Wing. "The blueprint shows this office is 40 feet deep, extending all the way to the exterior wall." David took a heavy tape measure from his belt and walked from the doorway to the back wall of the office. He checked the measurement, frowned, and did it again. 28 feet, David muttered, looking up at the plastered back wall. There's a 12-foot gap between this wall and the outside of the building. A solid 12 feet of unaccounted space. Harper's heart began to race. A cold draft seemed to be seeping from the baseboards of the back wall. "It's a false wall," she whispered. Grabbing a sledgehammer, David approached the plaster. "Stand back," he warned. He swung the heavy steel head in a wide arc. Instead of the dull thud of brick or the hollow crack of drywall, the sledgehammer struck the wall with a deafening metallic clang. The reverberation sent a shock wave up David's arms, forcing him to drop the hammer. "What the hell?" David gasped, shaking his stinging hands. Harper rushed forward and used a crowbar to chip away the crumbling plaster where the hammer had struck. Beneath a thin veneer of drywall and plaster was a solid slab of reinforced industrial-grade steel. It took them 4 agonizing hours with an angle grinder showering the dark office in a fountain of bright orange sparks to finally cut through the heavy steel locking mechanisms of what turned out to be a massive hidden vault door built flush into the hospital's architecture. With a groan of rusted hinges that sounded like a dying animal, the heavy steel door swung open. The air that rushed out of the hidden room was stale dry and oddly metallic. Harper stepped inside her flashlight beam, cutting through the darkness. This was no abandoned supply closet. It was a meticulously constructed panic room and private vault. Unlike the rest of the damp, rotting hospital, this room was bone dry. Along the left wall sat rows of immaculate grey steel filing cabinets. In the center of the room sat a massive antique Mosler safe, the kind used in early 20th century banks, complete with a heavy brass combination dial. But what caught Harper's eye wasn't the safe. It was what sat on the heavy wooden table next to it. Stacked neatly in absolute perfection were 6 heavy iron lockboxes. Stamped into the rusted lids of the boxes was an insignia that made Harper's breath hitch Chase Manhattan Bank, historical depository. "Harper," David whispered, his voice trembling. He had opened one of the filing cabinets. "These aren't medical records. These are property deeds. Dozens of them. And, oh my God." Before David could finish his sentence, the sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside shattered the silence of the asylum. Harper ran out of the vault through the office and peered out a shattered window into the overgrown courtyard below. A sleek black Mercedes S-Class had just parked next to her rusted sedan. The stark contrast of the luxury vehicle against the backdrop of the decaying, mud-soaked asylum was jarring. A man stepped out of the car. He was impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, carrying a slim leather briefcase. He didn't look like a county official, and he certainly didn't look like a scrap buyer. He looked like money, and he looked dangerous. Harper hurried down the grand staircase, meeting the man in the main lobby. "Can I help you?" Harper asked, tightly gripping her crowbar. "This is private property." The man smiled, though his eyes remained incredibly cold. He handed her a stark white business card. "Richard Helmsley, Senior Partner, Kensington and Associates." "Ms. Quinn," Helmsley said, his voice smooth and practiced. "I represent a private consortium, the Hess Family Trust. We recently became aware of the municipal auction." He looked around the decaying lobby with mild disgust. "It seems there was an administrative error at the county level. This property was never meant to be sold." "Well, it was," Harper said, her guard instantly up. "I have the deed. And a staggering environmental liability," Helmsley countered smoothly. "Ms. Quinn, I know about your financial situation. I know you work 2 minimum-wage jobs. I know you don't have the capital to demolish this site, which means you are facing total financial ruin." He clicked open his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "My clients are willing to make this very easy for you," Helmsley said. "Sign the deed over to the trust right now. In exchange, we will assume all environmental liabilities, clear your name from the county records, and—" He paused, looking directly into her eyes. "I will hand you a certified cashier's check for $100,000. Right here, right now." Harper stared at the man. $100,000. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. It meant freedom. It meant a real home. It meant safety. But as she looked at Helmsley's perfectly tailored suit, a sudden chilling realization washed over her. Helmsley, a high-powered corporate lawyer whose firm routinely handled cases for giants, like the remnants of Dewey and LaBeouf, didn't drive 3 hours into rural upstate New York to offer a charity buyout to an orphan. He was panicking. He didn't want the hospital. He wanted what was in the room upstairs. And if a man like Richard Helmsley was willing to hand over $100,000 in cash without blinking to keep her away from that vault, what she had found wasn't just valuable. It was priceless. "No," Harper said, her voice shaking but resolute. Helmsley's smile vanished instantly. The mask of polite corporate negotiation fell away, revealing something incredibly ruthless underneath. "Ms. Quinn," Helmsley said, taking a slow step forward, the atmosphere in the dark lobby suddenly turning suffocatingly tense. "You clearly do not understand who you are dealing with or what is actually buried in this building. If you do not take this check, I promise you, you will not leave this property with your life." Harper's mind raced. The sudden violent shift in Richard Helmsley's demeanor snapped her survival instincts into high gear. She hadn't spent her entire childhood navigating the perilous, unpredictable foster system, only to be intimidated by a man in a bespoke suit. She didn't argue. She didn't scream. Without warning, Harper violently hurled her heavy iron crowbar directly at Helmsley's chest. As the lawyer stumbled backward, gasping and throwing his hands up to protect his face, Harper spun on her heel and sprinted up the grand, sweeping staircase. She took the rotting steps 2 at a time, her boots slipping on the decades of accumulated grime. Behind her, she heard Helmsley shouting furiously at a driver who had just emerged from the idling Mercedes. "David!" Harper screamed as she reached the East Wing corridor. "David, get in the vault." David popped his head out of Dr. Hess's office, his face pale at the sheer terror in Harper's voice. Seeing her sprinting down the hall with 2 men in heavy overcoats, aggressively pursuing her, he didn't ask questions. He grabbed the sledgehammer and retreated into the hidden room. Harper dove through the jagged hole they had cut into the false wall and tumbled onto the concrete floor of the panic room. Together, she and David threw their combined weight against the massive rusted steel door. The hinges screamed in protest, but the heavy vault door swung shut just as Helmsley's driver reached the office. With a deafening clang, the steel locking bolts engaged. They were sealed inside. Seconds later, heavy fists began pounding against the outside of the door, accompanied by muffled, furious shouting. But the vault had been built to withstand riots and fire. 2 men in suits weren't going to break through 3 inches of reinforced industrial steel. Panting, Harper slid down the cold door and sat on the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He offered me $100,000 in cash for the deed," she breathed. "When I said no, he threatened to kill me." David wiped a thick layer of sweat and drywall dust from his forehead, looking around the airtight, claustrophobic room. "Harper, you don't offer $100,000 for a condemned building unless what's inside is worth 10 times that. We need to find out what he's so desperate to protect before we call the cops." With the threat temporarily locked outside, they turned their attention back to the table in the center of the room. The 6 heavy iron lockboxes, stamped with the Chase Manhattan Bank insignia, sat waiting. Using a heavy flathead screwdriver and a mallet, David systematically broke the rusted padlocks on the boxes. What they found inside defied all logic and reason, the contents of the lockboxes. Box 1 and 2, packed to the brim with mint condition, pre-1933 United States gold certificates. Unlike modern currency, these large-size bills, mostly $500 and $1,000 denominations, were historically backed by actual government gold. To a private collector, their numismatic value was staggering. Box 3 contained several velvet jewelers' rolls. When Harper unfurled them, dozens of heavy antique platinum rings, diamond brooches, and pristine Cartier watches spilled out under the harsh glare of their work lights. Box 4 and 5 filled with tightly bound stacks of corporate bearer bonds from the 1960s. These were unregistered financial instruments. Whoever physically held the paper owned the value. "This isn't an asylum," David whispered, holding up a diamond necklace that caught the light like frozen fire. "This is a pirate's hoard." But the real secret wasn't the jewelry or the cash. It was in the 6th box, which contained a single thick leather-bound ledger. Harper carefully opened the brittle pages. The handwriting was meticulous, signed with the initials A.H. Dr. Archibald Hess. As she scanned the columns, a horrifying, decades-old conspiracy unspooled before her eyes. The ledger detailed a massive systemic wealth extraction ring. Dr. Hess hadn't been treating patients. He had been operating a private prison for the inconvenient relatives of New York's elite. Wealthy families, including peripheral members of prominent dynasties like the DuPonts and the Astors, would secretly pay Hess to involuntarily commit heirs, bothersome spouses, or aging matriarchs. Once these individuals were locked away inside Oakhaven, isolated from the outside world, and heavily sedated, Hess forced them to sign over their power of attorney. He systematically liquidated their trusts, transferred their real estate holdings, and stole their family heirlooms. And the law firm brokering these illicit transfers, laundering the stolen assets through an intricate web of shell companies, was none other than Kensington and Associates. Helmsley's firm, Harper realized, her blood running cold. His law firm built its empire on stolen money. If this ledger gets out, they won't just face disbarment. They'll face federal racketeering charges and billions in restitution lawsuits from the victims' descendants. Suddenly, the pounding on the door stopped. David pulled out his heavy-duty job site cell phone. Deep inside the steel-reinforced vault, there was zero signal. "We're completely cut off," he said grimly. "We can't call 911 from in here." "We don't need to," Harper said, pointing to the massive vintage Mosler safe sitting silently in the corner of the room. Hess was a paranoid man. He built a panic room with an air supply system. Look at the baseboards. Harper was right. Behind the safe, a small cast-iron ventilation grate led directly to the exterior wall of the building. David immediately grabbed his crowbar, pried the grate off, and shoved his phone into the dusty ventilation shaft. "Come on," David muttered, watching the screen. "Just one bar." The phone pinged. A single bar of 4 GLTE appeared. David hit dial and connected with the Monroe County Sheriff's Department. 10 minutes later, the wail of police sirens pierced the quiet rural landscape. From their vantage point, Harper and David heard the screech of tires as Helmsley's Mercedes desperately fled the asylum grounds, abandoning the property just as 3 squad cars came tearing up the overgrown driveway. The ensuing fallout was explosive, transforming Harper's desperate $50 real estate gamble into a national media circus. Within 48 hours, the FBI's white-collar crime division had cordoned off Oakhaven Psychiatric Institute. Forensic accountants swarmed the property, seizing the 6 lockboxes, the ledger, and opening the Mosler safe, which it turned out contained another $4.2 million in stolen municipal bonds. But Richard Helmsley and Kensington and Associates didn't go down without a brutal, protracted fight. Operating on limitless legal budgets, the firm filed an immediate injunction in federal court, claiming that the contents of the vault were the rightful private property of the Hess family trust. They argued that Harper had only purchased the real estate, not the personal property left behind. Harper was outmatched, outgunned, and still completely broke. But the ledger had given her an undeniable ace in the hole. She took a massive gamble and reached out to Thomas Reynolds, a high-powered, fiercely aggressive attorney known for destroying corrupt corporate empires. Reynolds took one look at the photocopies of the ledger Harper had smartly snapped on David's phone while inside the vault, and he took her case on contingency. The legal showdown took place in a tense, wood-paneled federal courtroom in Manhattan. Helmsley, flanked by a team of defense lawyers, looked smug and untouchable. "Your Honor," Helmsley argued smoothly, "Ms. Quinn is a trespasser, capitalizing on a municipal clerical error. The assets in that vault belong to the estate of Dr. Archibald Hess." Reynolds stood up, adjusting his glasses. He didn't yell. He just smiled like a wolf. "Your Honor, my colleague is invoking property rights for a criminal enterprise," Reynolds stated clearly. He paced in front of the judge's bench. Under the Federal Treasure Trove doctrine and the laws of abandoned property, an individual who discovers hidden valuables in a property they legally own is entitled to them provided the original owner is unknown or deceased. Reynolds slammed a heavy binder onto his table. "Furthermore, Dr. Hess has been declared legally dead. His trust was a front for a massive illegal racketeering ring, run by none other than Kensington and Associates. By federal law, you cannot inherit the proceeds of a crime. The assets were abandoned in a tax-defaulted building. Therefore, my client, who legally holds the deed to Oak Haven, possesses the sole uncontested salvage rights to the physical currency and bonds found on site." The judge ruled entirely in Harper's favor. The moment the gavel fell, Richard Helmsley's smug facade crumbled. 2 weeks later, the FBI raided the offices of Kensington and Associates, dragging Helmsley out in handcuffs under the glare of national news cameras. The firm collapsed overnight. Because the stolen jewelry and specific estate deeds were tied to identifiable living descendants of the patients, Harper voluntarily relinquished those items to the state, so they could be repatriated to their rightful families. She refused to keep stolen heirlooms. However, the unregistered bearer bonds and the pre-1933 gold certificates were legally untraceable to any specific victim. Under the law of abandoned property and salvage rights, the federal court awarded them to Harper. After liquidating the bonds and auctioning the rare currency through Sotheby's Harper, Quinn walked away with an astonishing tax-free sum of $14.8 million. She didn't buy a mansion, and she didn't buy a sports car. The very first thing Harper did with her newfound wealth was hire a top-tier commercial demolition company. She stood on the hood of David Miller's truck, having awarded him a life-changing $2 million bonus for his loyalty and help, and drank a lukewarm cup of diner coffee as she watched a fleet of excavators and wrecking balls tear Oak Haven Psychiatric Institute completely to the ground. She paid off the county's environmental lien, in full remediated the toxic soil, and transformed the dark, cursed 42 acres into a beautifully manicured public botanical garden dedicated to the forgotten patients who had suffered behind its walls. Harper Quinn, the orphan who had spent her entire life feeling completely invisible, had finally secured her place in the world. She took a $50 joke of an investment, uncovered one of the darkest historical secrets in New York State history, and brought down a corrupt empire in the process. Did this unbelievable story of hidden wealth, dark asylum secrets, and ultimate justice leave you completely speechless? Harper's $50 gamble proves that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden behind the darkest doors. If you loved this dramatic true-life mystery, please smash that like button, share this video with your fellow true crime addicts, and subscribe to our channel. Right now, ring the notification bell so you never miss out on another incredible hidden treasure story. Stay curious and stay safe.